the understanding the connection between social support and mental health, part 1. I mentioned this in the last segment, but keep in mind that you will need this for this week's assignment, but you will also need it for assignment number 3 next week, because social support and mental health is also very much entwined with gender and sexuality, which is part of the focus of your week 3 assignment. You will also need this information for the exam because this class is cumulative, and again, we're big on scaffolding. So overview, and this shouldn't be too surprising because we've talked about this before, that social bonds, think Durkheim, social ties, are crucial to healthy human development. The way that we attach and relate to other people has lifelong consequences. So not only are you impacted by your support system in your day-to-day life, you're also impacted by your social bonds and how you were raised. And so a lot of this learning takes place in the home with immediate family, but not all of it. We'll talk about this more again as we move through the semester, especially next week, but social support is influenced by social statuses, including socioeconomic status, class, and gender, as well as marital support. So think about somebody specific that you know with a mental illness. And there's no right answer here, but just thinking about that person, which of the 3 do you think would be most significant in alleviating distress associated with what you know about their symptoms? Do you think increased social support, a decrease in stress, or increased coping mechanisms would be most effective in helping this person that comes to mind? Okay, and then which theory does this come from? So social support always involves either the presence or implication of stable human relationship. It's been referred to as a lot of things. So again, social ties, social bonds, social networks, meaningful social contact, availability of confidants, human companionship. Most research on mental health and what helps mental health in sociology focuses on social ties, but it can be under a lot of these different terms. All of these social bonds, social networks, social support, they all share a focus on the relevance of human relationships and especially the significance of human relationships in our well-being. And so social support has joined stress and coping as one of the 3 most important constructs in mental health research, specifically in stress theory, which is the answer to the quiz question that you guys just had. Again, it's been studied over time. So we know Durkheim's suicide. We can go back as early as the Bible, where in Genesis, we have that the Lord judges that, quote, "it is not good that one be alone." We had Spitz, who found that the nervous systems of infants who were deprived of maternal contact was negatively affected. We know that Durkheim found a relationship between social ties and mental health, so that the less socially integrated you are, means the less social support you have and the likely you are to complete suicide. We have Kazel and Cobb, who we didn't do a reading on them, but they're pretty famous because their research influenced nearly all aspects of the way that we understand mental health and social support, because they really had a lot of that preliminary evidence that showed that social support is an important buffer against life stress. But we have to think about how we are conceptualizing social support. So my question to you, and again, you can't get this wrong, it's effort-based, just a few sentences is fine. What does social support look like to you in your life? So something you might be catching on to at this point is that there's not just one type of social support. We have perceived, received, and structural, and I'll get into those in a second, but there's something they all have in common. And so social support can be understood as having at least one of the following 3 effects. So 1, information that leads you to believe that you are cared for and loved. Information that leads you to believe you are esteemed and valued, and information leading you to believe that you belong to a network of communication and mutual obligation. And so social support then refers to the clarity, or especially certainty, that you are loved, valued, and that you can count on other people when the need arises. Now, this is separated in sociological research from instrumental support and material support. So instrumental support, would be like your therapist, your psychiatrist, your academic advisor. That's instrumental support. Material support would be your employer, for example. If you are married and you get alimony but have no other relationship with your spouse, for example. So those are still types of support. Financial support is a type of support. Counseling is a form of, a great form of support. However, in sociological research, the focus tends to be on more social support that's not just resources and doesn't have that structural base. It is important to note that these are a bit artificial. So for example, your parents can make you feel loved and cared for. They can make you feel esteemed and valued. They can help you network. They can also provide you with material resources and, help you financially. And so it's not that it's one or the other. It's very fair to fall into all of these, but sociological research typically doesn't focus on just material resources. So again, we have perceived, structural, and received support. Perceived support is honestly what it sounds like. It's how much support you perceive that you have. If you need somebody to be there, would you assume that they would be emotionally? So when you talk about emotional support, that's just a simpler way of saying perceived support. Just the subjective belief or appraisal that you belong to a communicative and caring network. So if you think about a time when you were feeling down or a friend was feeling down and one of you said, how can I help you? And then the other person replied, it's okay, just knowing that you're here for me is good enough. That's perceived support. And if you've ever had this conversation with somebody, if you were on either end, you're probably aware of how impactful this can be. Structural support then refers to the organization of ties to one another. And so those are more the structural aspects, the system part of your support system. So how often you talk to the people in your network, how long you've known them, that's the duration, strength of bonds, degree of reciprocity, how big the network is, homogeneity, so the sense that you share the same race or gender or sexual orientation with a lot of your friends, how resources are shared among members. And then we have received support, the actual help that loved ones extend. These are all important. If somebody says, I'm there for you, and then every time we need them to be, they're not, well, even if the perceived support is good, if they continuously do not exhibit that received support, then the perceived support might decrease over time. So these are all related. However, what we find is that perceived support is the most important dimension of social support. Most significant findings on mental health regarding social support comes from studies on emotional support and perceived support. We find that the effect of this type of support on psychological well-being is greater than tenfold than observed for received support. So again, just the sense that if you need something, you have people who would be there for you is greater than tenfold more impactful than whether those people can actually be there for you. But again, if over time you keep finding that people are not there for you, that can then decrease the perceived support over time. There are two views to explain this. Why is perceived support so important? So there's a situation-specific model that says that perceived support is so important. It's especially helpful in response to particular stressful events. So in times of trouble, you're not as worried because you have loved ones that you can count on. Just that thought process is very comforting and will give you a buffer against life stressors. We also have the developmental perspective. So social support isn't just about who you can call today if something goes wrong, but so social support is also a crucial factor in your social and personality development, which is an extension of child development studies. So you might already be familiar with Harlow's study. It's a pretty famous study, but if not, don't worry, I got you.
Probably seen a little kid react to a sudden bang. So you've probably seen a little kid react to a sudden bang or a terrifying clown or some strange Santa at the mall, right? Yeah, not pretty. That child probably immediately reached for a parent looking for comfort, and that same kid might freak out if she was separated from her adult of choice, especially if she was in an unfamiliar environment. It's called attachment, and if you've ever seen a clingy kid, you know why it's called that. They'd attach. For a long time, psychologists assumed that this was just an intense innate survival instinct. I mean, it makes sense that babies would be attached to their food source, and bigger kids would stick around the people who helped them survive. But in the 1950s, American psychologists Harry and Margaret Harlow came along with a barrel of monkeys, complicating and illuminating our idea of bonding with caregivers in what has to be one of the saddest psychological experiments of all time. The Harlows were breeding rhesus macaque monkeys for their research on learning. Part of the process involved separating babies from their mothers right after birth, which, yeah, pretty cruel already. They began noticing the baby monkeys were very attached to the blankets they had in their cages, so they set up an experiment. They created two artificial mothers. One was a bare wire cylinder with a feeding bottle attached. They called that wire mother, and the other was a cozier cloth and foam wrapped cylinder without a feeding bottle, cloth mother. It took no time at all to see the baby's preference. They overwhelmingly preferred the comfy cloth mama, clinging to it whenever they seemed to be anxious or in need of comfort. And sometimes they fed from the wire mother with the baby bottle while standing on the cloth one. This discovery that attachment wasn't just about getting breakfast surprised a lot of people. It turns out that contact and touch are vital to attachment, learning, emotional well-being, and psychological development. As the brain and mind develop in infants, so too do their emotions and social behavior. Caregivers can greatly influence this development, and most psychologists will tell you that how a child is raised early on can have a huge effect on how they view the world, other people, and themselves, not to mention how they react to stressful situations or sort out moral dilemmas. I mean, it's a big, complex, challenging world out there, and wire monkey baby mama just ain't gonna cut it.
Okay, so the Harlow experiments are, the experiment is one of the most well-known experiments in child development studies. And again, a lot of this research on developmental perspective of social support comes from child development studies. So we can look at that and say that, these aren't really contradictory. It's not that it's situation specific versus developmental, it's both of them. So our perceptions of social support and the impact of those social bonds and social ties on our mental health are influenced by current experiences and relationships, but also long ago experiences and relationships. It's both of these. And so both of these perspectives view the social environment as the primary source of supportive experiences. The situation-specific model focuses on the contemporary social environment, and the developmental perspective focuses on the effects on the personality over time, with special significance in the developmental years. Okay. So sorry about that. So now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to jump into the explanation for your assignment number 2. I do not recommend starting assignment number 2 without watching this. It could be done, but you probably will not do well. Okay, sorry about that. My camera was freezing. I wanted to give it a second to load. All right, so you will find the instructions. By the time you get to this video, the instructions are going to be on Canvas. I will send an announcement to let you know. I highly advise against trying to do this without watching this. And what I do recommend is that you actually complete this assignment as we go through this, because I'm going to walk you through it step by step. And because of that, it'll be pretty obvious who didn't pay attention and who did. So this first thing that I want you to do, I Do not care how you do this. I know for some people that will be a bit stressful, and for some people that will be exciting. You can type it, you can write it down on a piece of paper and take a picture of it and upload a file. I'm even going to give you an option where you can draw it if you like. This is totally up to you as long as you answer all of the questions in the assignment sheet. So I want you to first list your support system. And I want you to be extremely generous and liberal with what that means. So don't just think of who's, really there. Don't, because again, we've talked about emotional support, but just think generally. So you can list your therapist, your counselors, acquaintances. Try to list at least 5 people, ideally no more than 10. If you have the bandwidth to list more than 10, then go for it. The more you list, the probably more illuminating this will be. But try to have at least 5 people, because we're going to be narrowing down and comparing those relationships. So don't worry too much about identifying the most, significant people in your life. Be generous, be liberal, and think very loosely about what a support system might look like for you. Also be specific. So I know that I don't know your friends, and you can use pseudonyms. I won't know the difference, but don't write friends, family, teachers. Write Professor Beck McField, ideally. Write, Ashley, Tanya, Brooke. So use actual specific names for these people, because we're going to be, again, comparing these specific relationships. So the next thing I want you to do, once you have your list of 5 to 10 people, ideally, could be more, ideally not less. Again, if it's less, try to think a bit bigger. Cross out anybody who is only instrumental or only material. So cross out academic advisor, cross out, unless if you have a mentor, strong emotional relationship as well, maybe keep that person. But if it's just somebody who you only meet with to schedule classes or when you need something academic, cross that person out. Cross out therapists, cross out your employer. So anybody who is just financial resources or who is kind of paid to be in your social support, cross that person out. All right, so you have the option, and you don't have to do this. I would like you, if you want, you can draw your social support system. You can draw your support system. You don't have to, you can work with a list, but if you would like to kind of have a bit of fun with this, feel free to go for it. If you choose to draw it or get creative, again, I will create the option for you to upload files and JPEGs. So if you want to do this, on hard copy paper, that's totally fine. I would love to accept such creative endeavors. So now what I want you to do for the next couple of ones, I'm just going to ask you a few, is to note for each of these people the duration of your relationship. So how long have you known this person? So all your life, 3 years, 2 months, doesn't have to be, 354 days. You can just say about a year. It's just a rough estimate. Okay, and then the next thing you'll want to do is note the frequency of contact. So how frequently do you speak with them? Daily, check in about once a week, maybe a couple times a month. Is it inconsistent? Maybe you'll talk every day for a couple weeks and then you'll speak a few times a year. So just next to everybody in your support system that you listed, note how frequently you talk to each of these people. Take a second, and you don't have to actually write anything down, but you might want to jot a note, especially given what you've learned today about social support, to notice any patterns. And I'll ask some probing questions. So if you're not there yet, don't worry. That's the entire point of me walking you through this. Now, what you can do, or what I'm going to have you do at this point, I'm going to give you just 3 different scenarios of emotional distress. And I want you to write who you would call from your support system. As many people as you want. If it's just 1 person, 5 people, all 10 people, just think. And when I say call, I don't mean send just a text. Like if this happened and you were overwhelmed by distress, who would you reach out to for support in that moment? So if something embarrassing happens to you, who out of your list, which people would you reach out to? If something distressingly infuriating happens, which people in your list would you reach out to? And then finally, if something devastating happens, which people would you reach out to? And so you'll see on your assignment sheet that I'll also ask you these questions. So we didn't talk about homogeneity. Homogeneity just meaning, do you have the same race, gender, class, social class, sexual orientation? I didn't have you list that, but if you can just think about overall similarities for homogeneity, that would be fine. So what you're probably noticing is that frequency and duration of contact, homogeneity, those are the structural aspects of support. Who you would reach out to if you are embarrassed or devastated or angry, that's the emotional support, the perceived support. So whenever you think about the people you would call for something embarrassing, are these the people who have the most similarities with you? Are these the people who you have known the longest? Are these the people who you talk to most frequently? When you think about the people you would call for something infuriating, are these the people who you have the most similarities with? Are these the people you've known the longest? Are these the people you talk to most frequently? And when you think about who you would call for something devastating, is this the person who, again, you share the most similarities with? Are these the people who you've known the longest? Are these the people who you talk to most frequently? And so generally what we find here, and it's okay if you find something different, but generally what we find is that the people who we would call in need of situation-specific support, sorry, went the wrong way. The people who we would call if we're in need of situation-specific support are not necessarily the people who you've known the longest, who you talk to most frequently, or who you even have the most in common with. And so this is why we might say things about our best friends, like, yeah, we don't talk that often, but I'm always there for you. And so whenever I have you guys do an assignment, I typically do it myself. I typically test it. And so I've actually done this assignment myself several times now. This is, I've done this a couple times in person, online. And what I find is that I have a similar experience where there might be people who I only talk to a couple times a year, but if something devastating happens, I would absolutely reach out to them. Where there are people who I've only known for a couple of years, so the duration isn't that long, but if I needed emotional support, I would reach out to them. And so what we see here is that for a lot of people, and if your experience is different, you're not going to get the assignment wrong. This is just a thought exercise. What we tend to see is that your perceived support doesn't necessarily have to tie to your structural support. Who is there for you emotionally when you need something doesn't necessarily have to correlate to who you've known your entire life. I have people who I've known my entire life and I would never consider calling if something devastating or infuriating happened. So the older we get, the less we talk to some of our closest friends day in and day out. This is because we get busy. Yeah, that's usually a part of it, or maybe you just don't need to check in that much. This doesn't mean that they are not the ones who we rely on when we feel distressed. And so this pattern reinforces today's lecture that, again, support, perceived support, emotional support, who we call to be there, is different than structural support. Who you talk to, how often you talk to them, how long you've talked to them, and how long you've known them. But again, you will notice similarities. So with homogeneity, for example, you might notice that, well, most of my friends or most of my system is the same race as me or the same gender as me. And so you might find some similarities based on the fact that maybe your friend network is pretty homogenous in itself. But overall, we see the takeaway here that if you're finding that structural and perceived support don't line up, that's totally fine. And if you find that they are, well, I have questions for that too. Again, you can check the assignment sheet. All right. So, oh, sorry about that. That should actually be filled in. Well, that's okay. We can just go to the syllabus. There's always a way around such tech errors. And of course, you know this as well because you know where to find your syllabus. So on Tuesday, we will do social support and mental health part 2. You will read Turner and Brown on Canvas. On Thursday, we'll discuss one of my favorites. We're getting into the social status stuff, which is super exciting for me and you guys will also love, I promise you, gender, sexuality, and mental health. You'll have 2 readings that day, but they're good, I promise. And then next Sunday, you will have assignment number 3, which is actually a media analysis. It's only 1 episode. It has a really, really well-known actor in it, and it's a pretty good time. So it shouldn't be too painless. You'll also have another media analysis upcoming. So I tell you every time, I've said it 1,000 times, you're probably sick of me saying it. If you need anything at all, please let me know. And you guys have a great day.